for example, the genocide of the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Syrians, it's something that is considered to be inconsequential to the major powers. And so people try to cover it up because it just gets in the way with the more important, let's say, business activities between the United States, Turkey, and Israel. So nobody wants to discuss it. So this is something that's buried constantly. Mm-hmm. So this is also very related to the idea of these poets in exile whose texts I use, and obviously the Siamanto, who was the Armenian martyr and poet, who wrote about the burning of the women in the desert, the Armenian women in the desert by the Turkish soldiers, but also Tristeza Vallejo, because he writes about being a poet in Peru and being somebody who nobody had any respect for, an unknown. He was writing some degree about being a mestizo there, you know. He was writing about being a person who had no identity there, but he was also writing about being a great poet and no one being able to recognize anything that he was talking about. So he writes this poem, and he says he describes himself as these as animals, as these kind of animals, the wretched of the earth, a person who is undistinguished in any way and wakes up in a little room and looks at himself in the mirror and wants to blow his head off, you know. And so, I mean, actually, so many of the poets that I worked with did commit suicide, or were people who were constantly on the move because they were treated like outlaws, or, you know, and I mean, Celan, was not able to escape the tragedy that his parents experienced, and even with the amount of cathartic writing these people did, it was still something that stayed in the brain, this feeling of isolation that is like a bullet in the brain, that is like a potential bullet in the brain. At first, when I received the criticisms about the work being too harsh to a lot of people, it did hurt me, because I thought one day that I saw a boy sitting with his mother at one of my shows who looked really sick, and I thought, how can I do this music? He looks so sick, and how can I do such harsh music, and how is there nothing comforting about my music? And it really, really bothered me a lot. And then I thought, if I am interested in doing therapy, then I should be a therapist. And if I want to be doing that, it's a separate profession. And as a matter of fact, I did do it as a separate profession. I did go into hospitals with some groups of people that I knew, and we would go visit people, and we would sing really pretty songs that they would request. I took requests from my fake book, and I'd sing, or I wouldn't sing, but I would have everybody else sing, and I'd play the piano, and everything from, Blue Moon to Hawaii, whatever, everything. But that's a separate gig, you see, and I'll do that. Definitely, I could play any fake book, any song. I'd play those gigs with my father, but I know the difference between therapeutic music and what it is that I actually do, and one should know the difference. One can do both. You can do both. At some point, I knew that I was going to work with a voice, and I guess I knew it at the same time that I started to work in anechoic chambers. And I worked in anechoic chambers because I didn't want anyone to hear me outside the door, because I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and I didn't want anyone to know that, and I wanted to be uncensored. I didn't want to be performing, I didn't want to have to worry, I wanted to be free to say anything in a completely, someone would say, unmatrix musical situation, blah, 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 blah. But it was like that, and I would, I was also experimenting, with, LSD and all sorts of stuff, so I'd go into a situation like an anechoic chamber on LSD and do these vocal things that, now, I don't know anything about what LSD did to my mind, I don't know anything about that. Probably the speed they mixed in it probably screwed me up more than anything else. But that's not even the situation of the anechoic chamber is so interesting because even if you scream, you get no reverberation back. As people can't hear you from outside, you also can't hear the reverberant sound of your voice in the chamber. So it's a very unrewarding circumstance in which to express yourself. So it was purely so that no one would be able to hear or judge or know anything. And I started the performances I did in darkness for that same reason, because I didn't want anyone looking at me. And then I would do performances with my back to the audience because I didn't want anyone looking at me. And even now, I'm much better than I used to be about it, but I have often used very dim lighting because I really want to be separate from the audience. Well, there was a line I've used, but many other people have used permutations of it, obviously in their own ways, which is, an artist must learn to embrace his or her limitations, and I've embraced mine, that being that I'm clearly interested in only one subject, which is isolation, which is this horrible state of isolation that you get through the extremes of any experience. You know, so even if I do a love song, I turn it into a song about bereavement, about isolation, the torturous experience. I like to take something and exhaust it, and I mean, that's another thing I had discussed a little bit, perhaps with Gabor, I'm not sure, I think so though, was choosing the variables that you're going to work with and then wasting them, just ripping them, using them, permuting them over and over again until you find what the essence is of that. And that's what I like to do with a song. Someone will say to me, what are you doing something like Insectivore or Shry 27-4 or Plague Mass, and then you go and do My World Is Empty Without You, Babe, and then you go blah, blah, blah. I mean, what's your aesthetic anyway? And I said, what's your fucking aesthetic? I mean, don't you understand what I'm doing? You would never tell a filmmaker, why did you do a film about, the bad boys in New York, and then you did a film about this, and then you did a film about this. But musicians are asked to put themselves into these locked cases. On the other hand, you would say, why did Xenakis do computer music and then write string first string quartets, then computer music, then go back to string quartets? And it's the same kind of thing. It's what you do with a song. It's not that you do the song. It's what you do with it. And I feel that with all the songs I do, I'm working on Edith Piaf and even Marlene Dietrich, as well as O.V. Wright and little, all these songs. And I like them. They become very cathartic, but not in an undisciplined sense at all. They become cathartic because I take them, master what the chord changes are, because the chord changes alone tell you the story without you don't even have to know the words. The chord changes tell you everything. And then work very carefully with the words and then play it and perform it so many times that I understand the essence of the song. And it's the same thing, I think, as composing. I really do. I don't see any difference. And it's, for example, Xenakis did political music, but the sound of it was saying what the words were, and often the words were very limited. There might be a word repeated over and over again or something like this. I feel, many people have said to me a long time ago, if you're so interested in the AIDS epidemic, why don't you write, very simple songs about the AIDS epidemic so people can hum the songs and then people can, and I said, I'm not interested in being the next Mayakovsky, I'm not interested in music as propaganda, and nobody's, I'm not employed, I'm not employed by anyone, I'm not a politician, I'm not running for office, I'm not interested in any of that. I'm only expressing my opinion of a situation that bothers me, and then again puts me into that pit that I go into, which allows me to create something I feel that I need to create. And so I'm doing it for myself, and the scream that comes out of it's not possible for me to dilute. It's not possible for me to do it any other way. I couldn't. And the words are the same. Again, the words are the same as the sound. And I feel that a lot of artists, especially there was this Jesse Helms period where people were drawing these gigantic penises of, to shock Jesse Helms. Of course he never saw any of them, but all these college students were drawing them, and artists were drawing them and putting them in art galleries. And I was like, listen, baby, what is that? What is that? You think that has any effect on anything? An artist is supposed to predict the future. It's supposed to be a visionary. You're not supposed to respond to an article you read in the Village Voice, for Christ's sakes, You're supposed to have a little more sophistication than that. And so I just feel that politics is never an excuse to make a simple-minded statement. If the work as art is not good enough, then I don't really care what a person has to say, because I'm not going to listen to it. Mm-hmm. It's just, you can put a message on anything. A person can make a painting that's completely yellow and say, this is about hepatitis. Mm-hmm. And you can say, oh, I can't argue that. I can't argue with that. The artist said it was about hepatitis, but essentially it's just a fucking yellow, boring-ass painting, mm-hmm. And there it is, and so what? Mm-hmm. So that's no better than going to a mental hospital and seeing someone slam his head against a wall and say the same word 25 times,
Mm-hmm.
What?
Mm-hmm. But
except they make a lot more money doing it. And that's what I mean by being invisible. In this culture, not only the dead are invisible, the living are invisible, no matter what we do. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, what do you mean you're singing Ornette Coleman? I said, let me tell you something. Or what are you singing the blues for? I said, let me tell you something. If you don't change, if you don't use every influence on the blues or make the blues refresh the blues, then the blues is going to be a dead coffee table tradition. If you tell people, you're the one to do the blues, you're not doing the blues, and you're not doing this, and you're not doing the Rebettica, and you're not singing country music, what's going to happen to the music? It's going to die. I sat with I guess it might have been the Golden Jubilee singers, some gospel singers on a plane once, and they said, people think that all we do is study gospel music and listen to other gospel records. We listen to country all the time, and we get inspiration for our next songs through country. And we listen to classical music, and we listen to ads on television, and we listen to this. And it's the same thing, and for me, the Middle Eastern influence of music, the scales from the Middle East, which are so different and so ornate, next to the pentatonic scale, which is West African legacy of the blues, is something that can be a great addition to the blues scales. And you can't just hammer down a fucking scale for the rest of his life. You can't just hammer it. And that's what we have in this country, is all these singers, rhythm and blues singers, are singing the same scales, the same blues scales. I don't care how many singers rip off Whitney Houston. She ended the line. And they just keep ripping her off and ripping her off. And it's because they're exploiting the same scales. They're not going outside the culture. They're not interested in the Middle Eastern culture, except to sample it on a record, because it's just, tokenistic music, and they're just a bunch of Arabs and Greeks and whatever, and that's a mistake. So what I do is really, in a sense, I take these musics and I don't combine them to be interesting or to create a fusion. I just tell the truth about what I hear, and in that form make the music new. And that's why I'm capable of singing "Lonely Woman" by Ornette, and because you got to be a great singer to sing "Lonely Woman." If you don't, you shouldn't touch it. I've heard people touch that song before. I've heard hysterical versions of it with words that are like, man, they should be just like hippie anthems, because they're so ridiculous. They are so ridiculous. And again, when we talk about the categories, and we talk about saying, it'd be like someone saying to Leontine Price, you better not sing opera because you're black. You better not sing Italian opera. And let me tell you something, you do not have the genetic predisposition to that. That is just a bunch of garbage. One of the greatest singers of the Italian repertoire, an incredible singer. It's garbage, and it is reflective of the same thing we're talking about that the Turks did, which is try to sterilize a country with a racial purity, with the object of racial purity. You can't do it. You can't do it. You can't tell a person not to hear what he hears. And when a person hears what he hears, he plays what he hears. And we have in New York with these idiots like Wynton Marsalis and all these morons at the jazz, the higher learning centers of learning like Lincoln Center, you know, who are playing the same old permutations, have screwed lots of really innovative jazz musicians out of a living, and they're just recycling the same old trash, and they've been doing it for years. And let me tell you, man, you know, if they want the music to stop, it'll stop. It'll stop. They'll be good for it. Maybe one of them will kick off soon and somebody else will take their place. You know, who knows? Absolutely, and that brings me gigantic joy. I have always been more delighted by the misery of my enemies than my own joy in succeeding at something. I'm not really sure why that is. It must be a Greek inheritance, because I really, really love that sort of thing. People will say that's a very low consciousness, and I would have to agree. But I don't. I have no reason to desert it. I see no reason to desert it. Actually, that's a very interesting point, because whilst they do seem to be opposing, they're actually the same, because of a line that I could draw, which is from Blind Man's Cry, where the person is on the cross but he doesn't believe in God, and he says, oh, he's saying, I wish I believed in angels, I wish I believed in God. The only thing I can believe in is death as the escape from this pain. And that's the thing. What I'm talking about is looking at that and saying, the worst thing is not to believe in God, not to believe in an afterlife, not to have to know that there is any justification for your suffering except that you suffered, that there was no reason for it, to have everything stolen, to be raped, to be tortured, and there be no reason for it. There's no good reason for it. There is no martyrdom. That's the person in Blind Man's Cry. He's saying that. There's no martyrdom here. I'm not going to be kissed by the angels. I'm not going to go to heaven. I'm not going even to hell. This is hell. And that's where it unites with my saying, there's nothing glorious about death. And where I say the living dead, or the dying alive, is my subject. And in the last breaths a person would draw, I can only imagine he or she would be thinking about his legacy. What have I left? Will anyone remember me? Will anyone remember me? Will anybody share a tear for me? And that's what I'm talking about.